Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro, and today we will discuss the employer's experience of working fully remotely during the pandemic and their approaches to returning to the office following the pandemic. Joining me for this is Tatiana Andreeva, who is Associate Professor in Management and Organizational Behavior and Research Director at the School of Business at the Maynooth University in Ireland. Tatiana, thanks for joining The Sound of Economics today, and how are you?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
I would like to remind our listeners that this episode is part of our series linked to Bruegel Research Program on the future of work and inclusive growth. And back to the issue we want to discuss today. So the forced mass-scale shift to work from home during the COVID-19 pandemic has changed both the employees' and the employers' perspectives on work location, demonstrating that more jobs could be done remotely than we could have ever imagined before. Since we emerged from the pandemic, there is an ongoing debate about return to the office, hybrid, and remote work. Employee surveys across different countries consistently indicate that employees prefer to remain working remotely and do not want to return to the office full-time. At the same time, many companies are trying to bring their employees back to the office. So, Tatiana, you have recently published a working paper for Bruegel on the topic. Why have you chosen the employer's perspective? And what do you think companies, workers, and policymakers can learn from it?
As you mentioned, there is so much discussion going in the media right now when, we see quite regularly in the newspapers quotes from top managers of big companies saying, how important it is to bring the employees back to the office. But when we looked at the research side of it to see what is the evidence we have, we figured out that we have quite a lot of emerging research right now that looks at the issue from the employee perspective. But we couldn't find any systematic evidence of how the situation looks from employer perspective. So how can we interpret why employers are trying to bring people back? This is why we wanted to look at the employer perspective to go in more depth in the question why, going beyond, just the headlines of the newspapers. And I think that having a better understanding why companies do what they do can help the companies themselves to manage the process better, but also can help workers to understand why the companies do what they do. Because I think instead of polarization of opinions, we rather need to find a solution that works for everyone. And I think it is also important for policymakers because in many countries, they are discussing right now the legislation in relation to what and how employees can request in terms of remote work. But I think there is much less discussion going on around how we can support companies in fulfilling this request. So this is what I hope our paper can help to understand.
The main buzzword has been going hybrid. What exactly that has mean for companies which have been trying to install a completely new working culture within their realm?
This is a very good question. And with it, you actually nailed it. Because everybody says hybrid, but what it actually means, it can mean millions of things to different companies. And we see this both from the interviews that we've done and from the other surveys that we have reviewed for this paper. So literally, when a company, for example, in the job ad says, we offer hybrid working opportunities, it may mean anything from we allow you to work from home 1 day a week to we are asking you to come back to the office once a month.
So the same name can mean so many different things.
Exactly. So anything that is between the traditional only in the office and fully remote can be hybrid. But as you can imagine, the variety in between is very different.
Absolutely. And this poses some challenges about how companies have been performed. But overall, during the COVID time, companies were actually performing almost, most of them, they've been operating fully remotely. And how did they perform at that stage? What did you find out in your survey? And what is to be expected now?
So we address this question in two ways. First, there is quite a big body of literature of existing research that was done even before COVID on working remotely, because remote work in itself is not very new. It just became so massive very recently, right? So we looked at the literature that has studied the fully remote work arrangements previously, before COVID. And this literature, the results are a little bit mixed, but none of them indicate any negative effects. So the previous research suggests that working fully remotely or predominantly remotely have either positive effects on employee performance, employee satisfaction, employee retention, or it has no effect on it. Though it is important to consider that before pandemic, the fully or remote working options were very often considered as a bonus. So you really needed to be a very high performing employee or a very trusted employee to be allowed to work remotely. So it is difficult to disentangle what the people working, for example, showing a high work performance because they were allowed to work remotely, or actually they were high performers in the first place, and therefore they were allowed to work remotely. So from this perspective, it's really interesting to understand what is happening now, because as you said, during the pandemic, everybody whose jobs were teleworkable were working fully remotely, and it didn't matter if they were high performers or not. So on this side, on the one hand, we spoke to the company leaders, asking them how did it go for them. And everyone we interviewed suggested that the overall organizational performance was not even just the same as before COVID. Many companies said that they were doing much better than before the pandemic. One of our interviewees said that they were able to go public as a company during COVID times because their performance indicators were so good. There is also some emerging research that we reviewed that looks at the employee performance during pandemic. And it also suggests positive effects on performance or no effect on performance. But here I need to make one important note that while, as I said, the studies do not show any negative effects on performance, but I think we need to differentiate between performance as an outcome or an output and actually performance per hour or like per workday. And there is a recent study that suggests that even though the overall performance did not suffer, people were working more in terms of hours. So it means the productivity in fully remote setting might be lower, but people compensated this by working more hours. So on the organizational level, this was not really noticed. And this study also suggests that these effects, which is actually very logical to understand, they depend on the type of the work people do. So the potentially negative productivity effects were for the jobs that required a lot of interaction and coordination with colleagues. And some of this coordination in some of the jobs might be more difficult or more time consuming when you have to do it online by multiple emails rather than when you sit next to each other. But for the overall company productivity, there was no negative effect at all.
Right. But on this point that you just mentioned, it resonates to one of the most common arguments companies make to bring employees back to the office, which is based around culture. So there is this premise that having employees present in the office should help to create, strengthen, improve, or amplify the culture of the company, as well as working together to a certain extent. Do you agree with that?
I think we do not agree with that. And actually, most of our interviewees do not agree with that either. because on the one hand, as I said, we did survey existing studies or emergent studies, and we could not find any evidence that the organizational culture suffers because of the remote work. No matter if we looked at pre-pandemic or post-pandemic research, there is some studies suggest that, certain types of culture are more supportive of the remote work, but this is it. We couldn't find any evidence. But when we spoke to the companies, interestingly, you're right. Many of them mentioned, that they want to bring people back because it is good for culture. But when we asked, do you have evidence for that? For example, many of the companies do annual surveys of employee engagement, of employee culture. So we asked, do you see any downward trends in the surveys? Do you really have evidence to support this claim? And they didn't. So only one company we interviewed was able actually to tell us what the organizational culture is, or what it is that they would like to retain. So our conclusion from this is that the culture argument is more about the feelings of the managers rather than evidence that supports it.
Well, speaking of the fears of the managers, what then about the issue, which I guess is very linked to that of monitoring and controlling the employees? This is quite a heated debate as more and more digital tools have been deployed since remote work became ubiquitous, to control the online time of the employees in order to be sure that they are doing the job. How about this issue? Is that also legitimate fear from the employer side?
There are definitely fears around this, but actually I do not think they are legitimate. So on the one hand, there is again previous research, quite systematic, that looked at the effects of the different digital monitoring tools when people were going remotely, and some of this research again done before pandemic. And all of this research unanimously agrees that there are more negative effects of these monitoring tools than the positive effects. So these studies report that the employee stress increases significantly. There is an increase in conflicts in organization, but what is also very important, that a lot of these monitoring tools lead to decrease in collaboration and cooperation among employees in the organization, because a lot of them are so individual focused, but for many of the jobs, we need people to work together, right? So to this extent, we were actually positively surprised that none of the companies we interviewed are using these monitoring tools. And they said it is clearly out of question for them, for the same reasons. They were concerned that it would bring many more negative effects rather than positive ones.
Okay. Well, this is obviously kind of reversing the general perception. So it's very interesting that your study, to a certain extent, is kind of debunking some of the myths which are building up around hybrid work and so on. So overall, would I understand that your research suggests that remote and hybrid work basically brings both opportunities and risks, but there might be a more weighting on the opportunity side, right? But when it comes to diversity and inclusion, I wonder, because on one hand, employers' flexibilities about work location could create more opportunities for groups of individuals to join the workplace. For example, employees could balance their work commitments with family care responsibilities, or facilitate access to work for employees with disabilities, for instance. But on the other hand, remote work may amplify the challenges these groups of employees often have at the workplace, or even create additional challenges. How do you see this gap or this risk in that area?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I think this is based on our study. This is actually an area of concern because all of the companies, or many of the companies we interviewed, suggested that they were able, due to more opportunities to offer remote and hybrid work, that they were able to hire a more diverse workforce, or to tap on a talent pool that wasn't accessible to them before. So on this side, our interviewees reported very happy, being very happy about this. But what we didn't hear from our interviewees, and this is where my concern is, that we didn't hear from anybody intentionally managing now this more diverse workforce. And the existing research that we know suggests that the hybrid work can bring more challenges. And I think from this perspective, this is what makes current situation different to what we had before pandemic. Because before pandemic, when we spoke about remote work, it was typically very, I don't want to say isolated, but there were specific groups of people who worked like this, and they didn't mix too much with others. What happens right now, especially when companies say they go hybrid, and as we just discussed, hybrid can mean millions of things. It means that we may have quite a typical team working for one supervisor, where one person is fully remote. Let's say 2 people come to the office 3 days a week, and these days may not be necessarily the same days. And then there are, let's say, 2 or 3 more people who are always in the office or mostly in the office. So it means that for a manager who supervises them, 2 or 3 people are in the immediate vicinity, right? So, they can have coffee together or lunch together.
All the informal networking.
Yes. And then some other people who are sometimes there, and then there might be some people who are never there. So during pandemic, and this is also what we found in our study, during pandemic, a lot of managers, because we found some studies that surveyed managers specifically, said that they found managing remote workforce more challenging than the usual one, because this coordination and informal team working was more difficult. But I think the situation during the pandemic was still easier than now, because at least everyone was remote. So they knew they could do the same thing for everyone at it worked. Now in these hybrid teams, people have different access to their manager, different opportunity to build relationships, to network, to get access to information. So this is a challenge of hybrid in itself. But if we pair this with the challenges that different subgroups can have. For example, we know that women, no matter, hybrid, no hybrid, they typically suffer from being excluded from important knowledge sharing networks in an organization. Or that sometimes in the meetings, they do not have enough voice to propose their ideas. So now you multiply this by a team having a meeting when some people are in the office and they're physically there, and then some people are joining online. And what if it is women who are joining online? So, the same goes for some other groups that were typically underrepresented in the workforce. For example, neurodiverse employees. They may have their own challenges in, for example, participating in online meetings or in meetings that are mixed with online and in the office. So my main conclusion from our study is not that hybrid work is bad per se or remote work is bad per se. It can bring a lot of benefits, but to avail of these benefits, companies need to really consciously manage the process to think, okay, I have a hybrid team, who is who and where, and how can I ensure that everybody gets equal opportunities in this new hybrid context? And I was really worried that we didn't hear in our interviews of companies really thinking it this way.
That's extremely interesting and worrying at the same time, if I may say. Because we're going towards the end of this episode, and I would like to look into the near future, but also looking a little bit beyond the company's part and looking into broader policies that can be set in place in order to ensure that this new way of working is taking off in the best ways for, as you say, for the mutual interest of both the companies and the employees at the same time. How do you look? I mean, what your paper fleshes out in terms of policy recommendations and somehow make some final observations around those before we leave our listeners for today.
Yeah, I would like to start first with the recommendations for companies, and then I move to the policy recommendations. So first of all, as I already suggested, we recommend that companies do not let the things kind of naturally merge with the flow. Because in some of the interviews, for example, we ask companies whether they have a clear policy on remote or hybrid work. And we heard quite a number of responses saying that they are experimenting with this. Therefore, there is no formal policy, and they let the middle managers and team managers figure out how to do this. And I do think that this creates a lot of ambiguity and a lot of confusion at the bottom of the organization. So, helping everybody, line managers, employees, to adjust to this new way of working, we recommend that the companies support them with the relevant policies. And in particular, we recommend that companies train their line managers. And this is something that we have found only one or two of the companies in our center were doing. And I think it's a worrying trend, because they would need, the line managers, team managers would need a lot of support. And I think this will really help the companies to benefit from the hybrid work arrangement. So from this, I move to policy implications. And, last week I attended a conference in Bruegel around the future of work and inclusive growth. And at this conference, we discussed a lot about the skills that are needed for the future, the skills that can facilitate for the workforce the transition to this future of work. And while I fully agree with everything that we discussed, I think there is one element that is kind of overlooked, that we talk so much about the skills of individual employees. But I think, based on our study, we also need to develop the skills of managing in the future of work. So it's not only about individual employees becoming tech savvy. It's about their organizations and their line managers knowing how to manage these hybrid teams that are going to be very diverse, with very diverse needs. And I think one of the policy recommendations is to pay attention to developing these skills on a more systematic level. And when we spoke to the companies, asking them why they don't provide more training for line managers, for example, I think a lot of them were puzzled because they didn't know what support is needed and what type of training is needed. And I think that there is definitely an opportunity for work to be done there on a kind of more policy level.
Absolutely. I think this is a good starting point for something that might evolve even further in the future. Definitely don't know how the mixed augmented reality, virtual reality kind of revolution that we might have in the next few years might bring in this concept of hybrid work. The concept of hybrid might evolve even further than what we might imagine at the moment. But while waiting for that, definitely the skills of the managers and the skills of the employees and the way of working together and matching these different sides are extremely important. And as you say, this cannot go without as well somehow company culture. Speaking about company culture, which we were speaking before, inevitably needs to evolve as well and needs to be updated. So it's all very good challenges. And I would like to thank you, Tatiana, for this insight into the paper that you actually co-wrote with Diana McCulley, that is available for our listeners to be downloaded and read on our website, www.bruegel.org. Unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for these episodes, but our conversations around the future work is continuing in the next episodes of The Sound of Economics dedicated to this series. And I would like to thank you once again, and thanks to all our listeners for following us. Until next time, bye-bye.
And thank you very much. And I wish all of us good luck with coping with these challenges.
Indeed, indeed.